Hello and namaste again, everyone. Today I'm here with the final round game of Norway Chess 2019. Before the final round, Magnus Carlsen has already been declared as winner of Norway Chess, but at the final round, Caruana was successfully able to beat Magnus Carlsen. Let's see how the game was started. Here, Fabiano is white, whereas Carlsen is black. With the total 13.5 point lead of Magnus Carlsen, Caruana just defeated him in the last and final round of Armageddon, Norway Chess 2019. Let's see how the game was played. E4 was the first move that was played by Caruana. E4, C5 was replied. Sicilian was played by Magnus. Knight to F3, Knight to C6, and Bishop to B5. Knight to F6 and Knight C3. Knight D4, E5, Knight into B5, Knight into B5, and then after Knight D5. Knight G5. Oh my god. These moves are really different than normal chess players. Do you ever play knight on B5, knight on G5? This knight and this knight can be immediately attacked. This knight and knight on B5 and knight on G5 can be immediately attacked by A6 and F6. Then why knight on G5 is being moved? According to Caruana, he says he remember this game showing him by his coach in 8 years old. Let's see how the game was begun. F6 was played by Magnus. Whoa, F6. Knight to E4 was played, giving up the pawn. F5, not capturing the pawn. Knight BC3, trying to extend. Knight into C3, knight into C3. D6 was played after castle. D into E5, Queen E2 attacking the pawn. After E6 was played, what happens if E4 instead of E6? If E4 would be played, then it would be rook to D1 followed by D2 to D3, E6, then after D3, E captured D3 and rook captured D3. It would be really bad for black. The king on the center will be attacked again and again. The queen on the center will be attacked again and again. The bishop will be developed and it will be, of course, really bad for black, and it will be losing for black, of course. Queen h4 might be coming, then after g3 again attacking the queen, queen g4, and again f3, and similarly the game will be in the pocket of the white. Let's see how the game was played. Instead of e4, e6 was played in the game. Instead of e4, e6 was played. And after queen into e5, capturing the pawn back. Queen d6 trying to extend. Queen e2, not extending the queen as white has a better position than black. Bishop e7. Carlsen might be thinking of long-term advantage because of the pair of bishop, whereas Caruana might be thinking of his rook file advantage. The bishop will be immediately open and the pawn on e6 is weak over here. b3 was played. What happens if d4? If d4, then c takes d4 and knight b5, queen c5, after bishop to f4. In castles, rook a d1, bishop d7, knight into d4, and white, and of course white has some advantage of his active pieces, but this was not played in the game. b3 was played in the game, trying to develop his bishop to the b3 or a3. Castles, bishop to b2, and then after bishop to d7, rook ae1 was played, and the correct rook. Why not on d1 and why on e1? Yes, e1, of course, when you are playing in the middle game of the chess, then you should open the rook in the open file. So here a rook is at the e1. What happens if rook fe1 is played? Bishop to f6 could be played, knight to d1, and e5 would be strong. White cannot toss the pawn of the e5. However, the bishop on b2 will be pinned as it cannot move, and a1 rook will be hanging. So here rook to ae1 would be great. If bishop to e5, bishop e5 and queen e5, then rook e e8 would be played by, and it would be winning easily for the black. So he didn't play rook fe1, instead he played rook ae1. ae1 was played, then after rook ae8 was played. This might be a wastage of time because bishop to f6 might be somewhat good. Bishop to f6, and then after knight d1, rook a d8, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, and after f4, bishop to c6, d3, and rook g6. And white has much harder to rearrange his own pieces rather than black, because black has already developed his piece bishop to the c6, and already rook on g6. The pawn on e6 cannot be attacked by any of the piece. This cannot be captured. The queen cannot capture this pawn because queen on d6 and rook on d6 is protecting it. So instead of rook to ae8, the better move would be bishop to f6, and it would be equal for black. But here, then after knight to d1 was played and bishop was open. Bishop to f6, and bishop takes f6, rook takes f6. What happens if g takes f6? If g takes f6 instead of rook takes f6, if g takes f6 would be somewhat interesting, but king g8 to h8 and bishop to d7 to c6. Now after rook f to g8, it could be played to the g open file for black, but it was not played in the game. However, it could be played. Knight to b2 was played then. Rook to h6 and queen to e5, trying to exchange the queen. Perhaps h3 and bishop to c6 could also be played. Queen into e5, rook into e5, and then after b6. What happens if he captures the pawn rather than capturing the queen? If queen into d2, what happens if queen into d2? If he not captures the e5 and captures the pawn on the d2, then rook d1 is coming up, and queen into c2 and rook to d7. Yes, giving up the rook for free, and it's winning completely for white. So he have to capture forcefully to the queen, queen e5, then after queen into e5, he cannot capture the pawn on the d2, rook into e5, b6, and then after e4 was played. The endgame is clearly better for white, as he will be shown by an eternal knight versus a worthless bishop. Black has an additional problem with his kingside rook, which is not very supposed to. Bishop to c6 was then played. a5, rook d8, attacking the pawn. A b6, a into b6, d3 protecting the pawn, rook d5 trying to exchange. Knight to c4 was played. More accurate might be rook fe1, attacking the pawn and forcing for exchange. King f7 protecting the pawn. Knight c4, this might be also played, but here immediate knight c4 was played. Bishop to b5 attacking the pawn. But even Magnus could try b5 as well. b5, rook into d5, rook into d5, e into d5, and then after knight e5 and f2 to f2 to f4 followed it, and rook to a open file might be quite interesting. But bishop to b5 was played in the game. Rook into d5, e into d5, and knight to e3 was played, attacking the pawn, f5 and d5. Then after d4 was played, knight into f5, gaining a pawn advantage. Rook e6, rook a1, open file, king f7, f3, gaining a space for king. King f6, knight g3 was played, then rook e7, not letting white rook to go to the 7th rank. Knight e4 check, king e6, rook a8, rook bishop to c6, rook a6, attacking the pawn. Bishop into e4, and this is again mistake here for black. Rook to b6, rook into b6 was played, and bishop to c6. The world champion says it's his last chance, that giving up and sacrificing the pawn. But yes, it's already losing for black now. Rook into c6, king d5, and rook a6. 2 pawn down, and it's hard for him to get back to draw position. It's hard for Magnus Carlsen to get a draw, already 2 pawn down. Rook e2 was played and rook a2, protecting the pawn. Apparently, this position was not the position which Magnus was pointing for, and he cannot expel the second rank, and it couldn't be according to his mind. But now it's Caruana turn to win. Let's see how the game was continued. King to c6 was played after h4. Now white king can go up from the h2, g3, and then after f4 or even z4. h5 was played, not letting h5 for the white to come. King h2, king b6, king g3, keeping king out from the second rank of the rook. Rook d2 was played after f4, g6, king f3, king coming to the center and being advanced. King b7 was played and b4 was an interesting move that was played by Caruana. It makes white rook out of the second rank, protecting the pawn, and it will be winning now for white. Let's see how Caruana could win this game. C into c4 was played. What happens if c into b4? Let me take out if c into b4, rook b2, king c6, rook into b4, and if rook into c2 and rook into d2, it's winning now. So here c4 was played by Magnus. c4, d into c4, d3, king e3, attacking the rook and the pawn. Rook into g2, king into d3, rook g4, rook a5, rook into f4, rook g5, rook into h4, and rook into g6, rook h1, and then here Carlsen resigned. Connected two passed pawn cannot be defended by a single rook. That was the reason here Magnus resigned. He didn't want to continue this game because he knows even Caruana is a candidate player and he had played with Magnus in the last World Chess Champ in 2019. However, the game was interesting. It ended with the very good in-game for Caruana. He could gain 2 pawns up and he could manage win with the 2 pawn rook pawn in game. Thank you everyone. If you do like my video, please do subscribe my channel if you have not done it, and be ready for the next upcoming video that I will be uploading you just by clicking the bell icon over there. And please do send me the suggestion that I can improve from this video and put it in the next video. Thank you everyone, and bye bye.